If you have your Bibles or if you want to use the screen, we're still in John's Gospel. We're still in the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. There is so much here. We started looking at the words and the actions of Jesus, and we've not finished yet. John chapter 10. Now I'm going to read with you verse 30, and then we're going to jump down to verse 36. So let's look at these words of Jesus. I and the Father are one. What about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy? Because I said, I am God's Son. Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me, and I in the Father. In this 10th chapter of John, Jesus has been in Jerusalem. Lately he has gone to the colonnade, Solomon's colonnade on the east side of the temple. It's wintertime, probably raining. The Jews have surrounded him and they've accosted him, and they've been trying to find some way to trap him. Here in this instant, this is the last thing he's going to say before he leaves Jerusalem. When he comes back again, the time is getting closer and closer. The Jews are getting more and more angry. The leadership is more and more angry. The tension is rising higher and higher and higher. And as Jesus is talking with them here on the colonnade, on Solomon's colonnade, he says something that infuriates them, and all of a sudden all this tension boils over, and they reach and they grab rocks. What are they going to do? They're going to throw them at him until they kill him. If you go to the 4th chapter, if you go to Acts, I'm trying to remember the chapter now, I've lost it. If you go into Acts chapter 7, there we go. In Acts chapter 7, you'll remember that Stephen, one of the first 6 deacons, got the Jews angry at him because his witness for Christ was so good they couldn't withstand it. They couldn't rebut it. They couldn't put him down. And so they grabbed rocks and they stoned him to death. So what that tells us is this was not an uncommon thing. And they knew they could get away with it. At least in the Roman eyes, in the eyes of the Jews. So they picked up rocks and they were going to throw them at him and they were going to stone him to death. And that was in that moment that Jesus sort of stopped everything by asking them a question. He said, "For which work are you going to stone me?" He had done a lot of different things. Many of them had seen the different things he'd done. So here they are, they're grabbing stones. He knows exactly what they're going to do, and he says, "Which one of my works are you going to stone me for?" They say, "Nope, not for works." And they have an exchange back and forth. And then Jesus asks them our question for today. He said, "Why then? Why then do you accuse me?" A lot of people accuse him. If we're going to get at the heart of this, we need to break this down into some sections and look at each one. Let's look first of all at the accusation. In the 33rd verse of this chapter, the Jews responded to Jesus. And this is what they said: "We're not going to stone you for any of your works. We're going to stone you because you blasphemed God." Do you know what the word blaspheme means in the dictionary? It means that you've done or said something that showed or that was an act of insulting God. That you did something or said something that put God down, that insulted God, that that slapped at God, that showed contempt for God. That's what blasphemy is. God is a holy God. He tells us that. The Jews understood that much. God is a very holy God. God says, don't take my name in vain. God says, have no other gods before me. He's a holy God. He says, I am a holy God. The Jews knew this, but what happens is they set themselves up to defend him. And they looked at Jesus, and they listened to what he said. Now, the Bible doesn't say this. So I'm going to take a little literary license here. But you remember, they had grown to hate him. They'd been looking for some excuse to accuse him. I think that in their minds, all of a sudden they said, ha! Gotcha! Gotcha! You blasphemed against God. Here's the heart of that accusation. They understood what Jesus said. They understood that Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God. The Son of God. And here's the problem. Here's the source of their rage. It falls in the category of how they saw Jesus. To these Jewish leaders, Jesus was just a man. Now, he did some things that they couldn't explain. But the very heart of it all was, in spite of all of that, they looked at him and they saw him as a man like anyone else. And for a man to claim to be God was blasphemy. Let's stop and realize that there could have been merit in their reaction. If you had claimed to be God, if I had claimed to be God, there would have been merit in it. If any human being, man, woman, boy, or girl, claimed to be God, there would be merit in their reaction. Now, you and I know that over the years since then, some have claimed that. But we're not going to deal with them today. We're dealing with Jesus, and the question that stands before us, because of the accusation that was leveled against him, is this: did Jesus commit blasphemy? Did he insult God? Did he show contempt for God? In his claim to be God, did he show contempt for God? Now, what I want you to catch, it's just a small thing. And if you're not careful, you'll overlook it. But I want you to catch something. Jesus didn't deny their interpretation of what he said. You claim to be God. He never denied that accusation they leveled at him. Now let's go on. Let's deal with our question. Did he commit blasphemy? Jesus committed blasphemy if he's not God. The flip side of that is, if he is God, then how can it be blasphemy to claim what you are? So the real heart of our question is, when we ask, did he commit blasphemy, is, who in the world is he? Fortunately for us, Jesus' next words give us two different answers to that. So let's look at them. The first one, testimony. You know what testimony is? Testimony is what Bob did a little bit earlier ago. Testimony is when you get up and you say something that you know. You get called into court, put your hand on the Bible, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They don't want to know what you've heard. They don't want to know what you think. Testimony is what you know. What you know. There are those who will tell you today, as they've leveled this charge through the centuries, that Jesus himself never claimed to be God. It's because he was careful in the words he used about himself. But you know what? This passage of Scripture we've looked at tells us that's not true. Tells us Jesus wasn't bashful at all in acknowledging who and what he is. Did you look there in verse 36? He said, I am God's Son. It can't get any clearer than that. He wasn't bashful at acknowledging who and what he is. But the Jews' accusation isn't coming out of verse 36. It's coming out of verse 30. Do you remember what he said in verse 30? I made sure we picked that up. He said, I and the Father are one. I'm not a real good language scholar, but sometimes I pick up some things that the language it was written in Greek tells us that the English doesn't. In the Greek, that word one, I and the Father are one, it's not a personal pronoun, it's neutered. It has no gender to it. Now, what does that mean? That means Jesus is not claiming that he and the Father are one person. He's claiming that he and the Father are one essence. That they share a unity of nature and essence. The very essence of God, that which comprises God, is the very essence of Jesus, that which comprises him. You can't get any more together than that. So when Jesus says, I and the Father are one, what's he telling us? He's saying, I am God's Son. And I am of the very same essence as God himself. Want to know who I am? My testimony. This is Jesus speaking. My testimony is, I'm God's Son. I'm God's essence. But you know what? We don't have to stop there. Jesus isn't the only one that told us that. God told us that. The 3rd chapter of the Gospel of Matthew in the 17th verse, the Bible tells us that Jesus went to the River Jordan where John the Baptist was baptizing, the last of the Old Testament prophets, and required John to baptize him. And when John lowered him in the water and brought him back up, God spoke. John, God's prophet, heard him. God said, this is my Son. Oh, maybe John misheard. In the 17th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, in the 5th verse, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him up on the Mount of Transfigured and revealed a part of his glory. And God came in the form of a cloud, and out of that cloud he spoke, and Peter, James, and John heard God say, guess what he said? This is my Son. Now catch where we are. We don't have just one testimony. We've got two. We've got Jesus telling us, I know who my Father is. We've got God saying, I know who my Son is. We've got them both saying, Jesus is the Son of God, of the essence of God. I like that. That ought to be enough for anybody, but we don't have to quit there. As long as we're talking about testimonies, we've got other testimonies. You know that we do. In Matthew, the 16th chapter and the 16th verse, Jesus took his followers, his apostles, up to Caesarea Philippi. And while they were there, he said to them, who do you say that I am? That's a key question. Who do you say that I am? Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now we got Peter's testimony. That's pretty good, isn't it? Paul, the apostle, before he became an apostle, in the book of Acts, chapter 9, verse 5, Paul is on his way to the city of Damascus with letters from the high priest enabling him to arrest those who are Christians that are hiding out in Damascus. And on the way to Damascus, all of a sudden a light shines out of heaven that Paul says was brighter than the sun, so bright that he couldn't even stand, and he fell at the roadside, and he heard a voice talking to him. And he said, "Who are you?" And the voice said, "I am Jesus." This is after the crucifixion, the resurrection, and his ascension into heaven, speaking from heaven at the right hand of God, where only God's Son could be. Jesus spoke to the Apostle Paul. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a lot of testimony. It's not all, but that's a lot of testimony about who he is. And for some of us, that's enough. But guess what? He was standing there on the colonnade, probably in the rain, in a winter day. The Jews had stones in their hand. They wanted to kill him. And testimony was not enough. If you're here today and you don't have Jesus Christ in your heart and life, has testimony been enough for you? It's not uncommon for us to ignore testimony. So that's not really even the heart of what he's saying, although that's there. There is the second aspect. Jesus said, now gather in, catch this. Jesus said in verse 37, "Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father in heaven." In verse 38, he went on and said, "But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me." Here's the point. If you don't believe the testimony, then look at the way he lived his life and the things he did while he lived his life. What does that say to you and me? What Jesus is really doing is he's acknowledging something. It's one thing to say something, but it's a far different thing to do it, to be able to do it. So Jesus has said, "I am the Christ. I am the Son of the living God. I am the essence of God." Now, am I lying? Am I blaspheming? Look at my works. Look at the things I've done. What do those things tell you? If we'll look with an open mind, those works are proof positive. If we look with an open mind, those things testify about Jesus as to who he is in such an unmistakable, irrefutable way that they tell us the answer. Did he commit blasphemy? Did he commit blasphemy? Or is he the Son of God? Jesus' words were, "I am God's Son. Now look at the things I've done." We have to be honest. I don't know anybody throughout all the pages of history or in our world today that could do the things that Jesus did. Do you? Nobody else has ever even attempted them. Nobody else could even do them. Think about the things that he did. He healed the blind, the lame, the mute, those with leprosy, and countless other illnesses. Sometimes with a word, sometimes with a touch. Sometimes he was present, sometimes he wasn't. 3 times He brought the dead back to life. The widow of Nain's son on the way to be buried. The daughter of Jairus, the head of the synagogue in Capernaum. And the kid brother of Martha and Mary, a young man by the name of Lazarus, dead 4 days, lying in the grave. 3 times, he brought the dead back to life. And then my personal favorite, he told the sea to calm down. And it did. Cindy and I were on a cruise last February. The waters got a little bit rough. I don't know why. It didn't bother me. But oh my goodness, what it did to her. And I'll guarantee you, she'd have given me anything if I could have said, quiet down, and the sea had gotten still. But I couldn't, and you couldn't, and nobody else could, but Jesus did. It calmed down. And with a small, quiet word, be still, a storm stopped raging. It just quit. It was over. Now, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to get you and me to see what Jesus was trying to get the Jews to see. The things he did could not be done except by God. And the only one that had that power was God, and because he yielded it, it came back to say who he was. He said, "Why then do you accuse me? When you look at my words, how can you say that I blaspheme God?" If he really is the Son of God, he's giving God the credit by claiming who he is. There's no blasphemy there. None at all. So here's the heart that caught me with these verses. If you've been successfully ignoring the claims of Jesus, in spite of the testimony of some people maybe that you know like Bob, or the figures from the Bible, then how can you go on doing it when you look at the things he did? And there were countless people that testified to the fact he did them. And those Jews in front of him, they saw many of them. How can you not recognize who he is? I can't.